Each year in Singapore, about a week after the National Day celebrations, it is customary for the Prime Minister to deliver a nationwide address broadcast live on television called the National Day Rally. The equivalent of the State of the Union address in the United States. The speech, coming after the pomp and festivity of the parade, is styled as an occasion for reflection, recollection, and projection, a time to take stock of the nation's progress, while anticipating the developments to come. Within this broad framework, the event has since its first iteration in 1966 also been harnessed by the country's successive leaders for various ideological aims. May it be to reinforce the national narrative, to consolidate communal values, to debunk criticism towards the government, or at times even to lecture what is deemed to be a complacent electorate. Of equal interest is how the event has over the years developed from being a mere display, or rather a mere delivery of discourse, into a media event in all senses of the word, meaning both an event transmitted by mass media, as well as an event that itself encompasses acts of mediatization. By this, I refer to the dominance of screens in the background dwarfing the Prime Minister as he delivers his speech, as seen especially in the rallies of the recent years. And upon these screens are projected all kinds of images, mostly images of history, of memory, images of collective identification, images in which the masses see themselves reflected, images that in other words operate in the register of representation, through which a stable object of knowledge is given visible form. But then there are the images of the future, images of that which is yet to come, and therefore requires an image to anticipate its arrival. We see such images most often in the computer-generated visualizations of the various infrastructural projects that the government has in the pipeline, where the graphic works not just to represent, but more importantly, to excite the spectator and solicit its participation in the future to which it points. Accordingly, such images are marked by a cinematic access, where the film's surplus of utopian affect takes priority over faithful representation. The point is to conjure a sense of a forward rush into a horizon by way of a magically empowered, gravity-defying gaze, in turn opening for the viewer a world of possibility to be filled by its hopes and aspirations. The image as such becomes a call for investment and speculation. Or one can say that the image becomes a kind of green screen. But what exactly do I mean by green screen? Quite rightly, most of you are probably thinking of the technique used in cinematic post-production that involves substituting a filmed green background with another image, a method that is used in sci-fi and fantasy films to create a world of the future. Green here is the image that calls out to be filled by our own projections. But in calling the screen behind the Prime Minister green, I also have in mind another variegation of the color. I'm talking of the green of the botany that inevitably seems to sprout out in any futurist imaginings of Singapore. In fact, I'm just as struck by the sheer amount of green foliage that appears behind our politicians each time they address the nation, sometimes not as real physical plants, but as a projection upon the screen, which is what happened in the most recent National Day rally held just last month, which saw PM Lee stand before a screen greened by an image of generic shrubbery. Now, I want to compare this image with another captured just a year ago at the same event, during which, by accident or otherwise, the man stood before a screen that was literally chromatically green. In fact, the green of the green screen that is used in green screen compositing. Looking at the image, I am tempted already to replace the green behind him with all kinds of backgrounds, but for now, I shall resist. So on one side, a screen that is filled with the fuzzy green of botany, and on the other, a functional green screen that demands to be filled. The difference, it seems, is between green as a wallpaper and green as a site of projection. But are the two operations really as different as they appear? What happens when we bring these two images together, these two variations on the green screen, to think the relation between greening and screening, may it be in Singapore or elsewhere in the contemporary world? Where do the politics of cinema and the politics of botany intersect? Where does one locate the botanical in the screen and the cinematic in the green? And what kind of spectator do such convergences produce? To answer such questions, let me now move briefly away from Singapore to cinema history to find out when and how exactly did flora come to populate the screen. Of all the films I've seen in which the image is marked by the presence of the botanical, Robert Flaherty's 1948 Louisiana story presents a most curious case where the appearance of the trees in the frame serves a narrative that implicitly threatens their existence. Set in the idyllic backwaters of Louisiana in the United States, the story follows a young boy as he goes about his daily life exploring the wetlands, encountering several small misadventures along the way. It is an unsentimental, yet deeply moving portrayal of the simplicity of life amidst nature. Indeed, with no conflict of real consequence happening throughout the film, it is no exaggeration to say that the film remains so eminently watchable is because of its setting, particularly how it lends itself to the proliferation of trees in the background, as if with the trees, the image becomes immediately cinematic. But the more disturbing use to which the trees are put concerns a subplot that, oddly enough, is barely elaborated upon: the incursion of the petroleum industry. The boy's father has agreed to let an oil company drill in the stream that runs behind their house, leading to an arrival of an oil rig and its crew of drillers. Strangely though, this is hardly registered as a disruption, with the boy enthralled by the impressive machine and striking up conversations with the friendly workers. The violence of the drilling is barely depicted. In fact, as it goes on, we are whisked away from the scene to watch the boy wander among the trees that literally cover up the wrecking of environment by capital. The filling of the screen by nature screens out the scenes of its devastation, further passing off the relation between nature and capital as what's natural. No wonder then that for many years, the film was mistaken as a documentary, when in reality it was an advertorial underwritten by none other than Standard Oil, at one time the largest oil companies in the world. Yet, one still cannot help but be captivated by the sight of trees. Truly, there seems to be something about trees that make them the preeminent cinematic background. And recently, a friend of mine, noting our shared preferences for films set in the forest, even commented that one cannot make a bad film amidst trees, given how their presence immediately offers so much to be seen. The cinematic power of trees in this sense seems to come from their ability to fill the frame, suggesting the plenitude of a world in which even in what appears to be our solitude, there will always be others standing by. As John Berger puts it, not without irony, trees offered man the measure of his upright space, and this offer, mysteriously still present today as I fill up the chainsaw with petrol, there's the discreetest assurance in the world that we have never been utterly alone. Indeed, trees appear to be always already there, from the beginning itself, without beginning. They are the always already. This means that they're not just in the background, but together form the background itself. They are the ground before which there can be no prior ground. Their presence removes the shock of the void, of beginning in nothing, with nothing. No wonder then that the child could point towards the trees moving in the wind and claim that it is the swaying of the trees that is causing the wind and not the other way around, as if trees always have to be the prior term. Here, I'm further reminded of a quote by the American filmmaker D.W. Griffith that ties the appreciation of trees with a particular mode of cinephilia. Lamenting on the demise of quality filmmaking towards the end of his life, the director says, "What the modern movie lacks is beauty, the beauty of moving wind in the trees." This expression has since been reinterpreted as a renewed call for the cinephilic gaze of early cinema, where the spectator, instead of focusing on what's before him, allows his eyes to wander to the trees in the background, a gaze that refuses the absorption of narrative for the pleasures of the singular, of the things in themselves. But one must not also forget that Griffith was a filmmaker of such aggressively right-wing films, such as Birth of the Nation, such that the cinema of trees, by extension, can be seen to feed a deeply conservative mode of cinephilia. That is, in such films, never are we so distracted by the moving foliage to forsake the message altogether. The gaze that the trees command ultimately return us to the main subject of the film. They are the ambience to the presence in the fore, just present enough to be registered without taking over the scene. The comfort noise that assures us that we are in a world, some kind of world, where meaning is as secure as the background of trees. Moreover, by claiming the space of the background, trees also work to block whatever may truly lie behind the scenes. They are the filter that obscures the clamor behind the leaves. The propagation of green functions as the screen of propaganda. On 16 June 1963, the late Lee Kuan Yew planted a mampet tree at Farrer Circus in Singapore, launching a nationwide greening movement that continues to this present day, earning the highly urbanized city-state its moniker as Garden City, or more recently, a city in the garden. This will be one of the late Prime Minister's defining legacies. More than 50 years ago, the man had already foreseen how the propagation of green can help to soften the harshness of tarmac and concrete. As he once put it, the goal was to make Singapore into an oasis in Southeast Asia, for then businessmen and tourists would make it a base for their businesses and tours of the region. Even more fascinating is his contention that greenery can help to combat the soul-sucking nature of capitalist modernity. Believing as he did that a blighted urban landscape, a concrete jungle, destroys the human spirit, greenery is thereby endowed with a capacity to restore to the city its soul, imparting to it an essence, its nature from without. And it does so through an image of nature, an image of the permanence of trees. In fact, looking at this particular photograph, it's remarkable how, in the moment inaugurating a Singapore of trees, trees are already present in the background, filling up the horizon. They appear behind the man who claims the status of founder and stands in the site of founding itself. They are the authorizing presence prior even to the ultimate figure of authority, authorizing his power from behind. And thus explains the prevalence of trees in the literal background of political discourse in Singapore. Trees do not speak, but in their muteness and self-assurance, they lend to the site of discourse an equal measure of their authority. And wherever the discourse is most unstable and even completely groundless, their presence becomes even more necessary. Now take, for instance, the arrests and detentions between 1987 to 1988 of over a dozen social activists on the dubious charge of being a part of a Marxist conspiracy to overthrow the government and establish a communist state. This was just 2 years before the official end of the Cold War. In its time, the shakiness of the narrative of the building of a dangerous subversive force within the country could not help but arouse the suspicions of many who believed that this was yet another attempt at suppressing opposition. So, in order to persuade the people of its claims, the government resorted to an old tactic: televised confessions. This is the opening shot of the confession of Vincent Cheng, the alleged lead local ringleader of the conspiracy. In the center is the man himself, and facing him are the journalists who are to interview him. Now, the form that this particular confession took was not too dissimilar from those that happened before, starting with a profession of guilt, followed by an explanation of how the detainee sought to carry out his plans, and ending with a recantation of his beliefs. But what fascinates me most of this confession is not anything in the order of what is said, but what occupies the space behind the speaker: the row of potted plants. According to Cheng, the interview was conducted in an empty hall in the ministry, and the plants were specially brought in to make the situation appear more like an interview and less like an interrogation. Through this most minimalist of sculptural interventions, it was hoped that the greens can help to soften the visible signs of a confession that was made under coercion. Fortunately, this was not meant to be. The broadcast of the interview only increased the skepticism towards the government's narrative, given Cheng's jittery performance, with the cornered man often appearing to be pressured by his interviewers to give the right answer. I would like to think that the plants in the background further contributed to this fiasco, seeing how, just like the interviewers and their questions, they also appear to be so clearly planted. What they stand for is not nature itself, but its displacement into a pot. So averse was the reaction to this broadcast that it was said that Lee Kuan Yew blew his top, resulting in the production of a second television program, this time a full-length documentary featuring interviews with all 16 detainees. And instead of transplanting nature into the interrogation room, the detainees were brought out into the midst of nature itself, right into the center of the garden city, speaking, as you can see here, against a background entirely filled by green. One can truly see the wind moving in the trees. And in turn, what does not see are the hands controlling the spectacle from behind the bushes. After all, in the garden city, one is trained to see the trees only for themselves and not what is behind them. In the garden city, the trees simply are. Yet, the odd thing is that not too long ago, before such botanical seductions were mobilized by the government, trees and associated greenery were themselves subjects of intense scrutiny. Specifically, they were seen as icons of a deeply conservative regionalism, or at least conservative vis-a-vis a growing left-wing anti-colonialist movement. Here, I'm referring to the division that developed in the pre-independence years in the art community between the British-affiliated art societies that focus mainly on depicting landscapes and the simplicity of village life, and the burgeoning social realist movement that sought to reflect the grit and grime of the urban working poor. For the latter group, not only did the idiom of the pastoral work to screen out issues of the real world, it also reinforced a colonial logic that conflates the native with the detemporalized natural world, and in doing so suppressed the possibility of revolution and social change. Given this, in the paintings of the social realist movement, trees receded from view, or even when they do appear, they do so amidst a scene of destruction. Certainly, in many ways, the relationship between these two camps goes beyond strict oppositionality. In this regard, I note recent writing that has especially sought to reclaim the depiction of nature by the so-called Nanyang School of Artists, by arguing for the hidden scripts of resistance beneath the green. The intervention that I now seek to perform is also a task of reclamation, except that it involves the excavation of an image of nature from the site of resistance, or green as resistance. Here, we have perhaps one of the most oversighted paintings in Singapore history, the epic poem of Malaya by Chua Mya Thi. Painted in 1955 amidst an anti-colonial drive, the work depicts a teacher figure standing amid a huddle of listeners as he gesticulates towards the sky. It is an image of a community sharing an orientation towards the beyond. In its upward thrust, it offers an inversion of the earth-bound pressure that we saw in the photograph of Lee Kuan Yew tree planting, where the gazes of the onlooker are turned instead towards the ground, specifically towards the spot where the Prime Minister is aiming his shovel. So while the forceful shove of the gardener's hand in this image encloses the range of vision, the open, outstretched palm of our impassionate orator opens it. That the shape of the palm mirrors the palm trees in the distance being bent by the strong winds further suggests an identification of this open future with the horizon in the background, a horizon marked by green. By this refiguration, the green in the background no longer marks the eternal site of nature with the capital N, of nature as the always already there, but rather that which is out there, yet to come. The winds in the trees are the winds of change. But let us also return to the image of the circle of onlookers leaning towards the clearing on the ground. For if the anticipation on their faces is any indication, does it not suggest that upon the vacant plot is also a space of opening? Perhaps then, it may be more accurate to say that between the two images are really two variations of opening. That is, while the hand of the teacher figure reaches towards the infinite, the opening upon the gardening plot happens only within a circumscribed space, within an identified site that functions as a kind of screen upon which we project our speculations of the future. Or one can call it a green screen.
Hello and welcome to our three-dimensional graphics studio. This is just an introduction to how it all works. I thought you'd like to see the space, first of all, which of course is very, very green and actually quite big. I mean, I can jog around this. There's quite a lot of, I'm not giving myself a lot of exercise there, but there's just quite a lot of space here. That's the first thing you notice. And of course, the greenness of it. And I've got here in my hands, just to illustrate how this thing works, a piece of A4 card. And as you can see, this is the same green as the studio. And it's a very special shade of green because it's a green the camera picks out and replaces with graphic if it's put on a certain setting. And Chris, our director, will put it on that setting now. And so there we are. There's the card. You see that? So now the card is invisible, as you can't see it. And as a result of that, that's why we have the green in the studio. If I wear a green tie, I disappear. So I can't wear a green suit or anything like that. I have to wear stuff that isn't green. And what we now do is we put in graphics and we have the whole graphical experience. Before I show you that, let me just introduce you to the crew here. Actually, we need to turn this off to see them, crucially, because otherwise they'll be hidden. And you can see, this is Donovan here. Camera one, camera two? Camera one. And then Ed over there is working on parliamentary constituencies and the differential swing in which county?
All of them.
All of them. He's quite intense, to be honest. James is the floor manager. James has to stand by that monitor or it just topples over. And then if you have a look behind you, the crucial person who does the jib here, and this is a big camera with a big long arm. There we are. He went away again, but it's Matt at the back. Okay. So, come over this way. I'll show you how these cameras work. They have on the top of them an eye here. It's this glowing green thing. And this enables the camera to look at the ceiling. And if we have a look at the ceiling ourselves, on the ceiling you will see these circular things we call targets. And they're all, if you look closely, you can see they're all different. The eye on the roof of the camera is looking at the targets on the ceiling, and they're telling the camera very precisely where it is. And that led us to the big jump forwards in graphics. So we'll just bring on the graphics for you, and I'll show you what I mean. It used to be they would sit there in 2 dimensions behind the presenter. I mean, that was amazing enough. So they would be there, and I would be here. Then we got to a situation where actually, if I bring on this graph here, we'll just bring on some numbers, councillors across the UK, and we're showing the trajectory there. You can see that as the camera moves, I move, but also the graphic moves. So this thing that isn't there, the camera's not only put it there, it's worked out where it is in 3 dimensions, and it's moving it. So you get perspective. Move the jib for me, Matt, a bit, and we'll see just how powerful this effect is. Look at that. Now, the other thing that was a big jump forwards was to suddenly say, why don't we let the presenter go behind the graphic? So at this point, as I clear the graphic, the director can flick a switch, and what happens is I'm now able to walk behind it. And although that may not be very dramatic, it gave us a thrill when it happened for the first time, and it actually represented quite a big step forward. So suddenly you've got a graphic almost existing in its own space that can be walked around. It's an amazing sort of modern illusion. And crucially, it enables us to explain the politics of the night in a way that I hope for you watching at home is as clear as a bell. That's what I hope the graphics can do. The only problem for us is when it goes wrong. When it goes wrong, it's normally my fault. So what happens is, for example, I'm backing towards the graphic here, and for some reason we've got it on the wrong setting, and I back into the graphic, and then immediately you suddenly feel this thing isn't real. Look at that, because it never fully disappears. I'm always in front of it, and it's always behind me, but I'm getting smaller, and it isn't. So the effect is destroyed if I back through the graphic. If I'm behind the graphic like this and I come forwards, you see gradually it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So that is what I must not do. Anyway, back to the green. That's our explanation of how we're doing the graphics this time. We get little changes in the technology as each year goes by. But again, we always come back. We love our politics here, so we always come back to the politics and what we're trying to say. Although we have, as my hero Peter Snow would have said, we have a bit of fun here, it always comes back to us just trying to work out what are we trying to say? What are the numbers saying to us? How do we analyse them to make it clear for you? So, as I say, I hope you enjoy our coverage this year.
So from the greenery that fills the screen, we now enter the green screen. In the age of the superhero film and Game of Thrones, this one novelty apparatus has now become the central element of the cinematic complex. A further curiosity is how it is not just in fantasy or sci-fi where this process has become ubiquitous, but also in the genre most firmly located in the domain of the real, television news. In particular, news programs that partake in projections of the near future or in depicting a rapidly changing present, as in the weather forecasts or elections coverage. Once used to transcend the limits of the real, the green screen today is used to keep up with a reality that perpetually surpasses our grasp. Its power is its mutability, how it lends itself to be quickly replaced by new images as the events in reality unfold, responding to them in various modes of representation, analysis, prediction, speculation. The green offers a space where things can be freely moved around and tested out, a space of cinema as participation. Of course, when considering the full history of the technology, this mode of participation was, and to an extent still is, accessible only to an exclusive class of media producers. Consider the predecessor of the green screen technique that was the sodium vapor process or the yellow screen process. Invented by the special effects pioneer Pedro Valhos, the process involves using a specially devised prism to split off specific wavelengths emitted by the powerful sodium vapor lamp. Its accuracy, as demonstrated in the film Mary Poppins, was such that it eliminated the long-standing problem that plagued cinematic compositing, the thin outline of color surrounding the composited figure. But as effective as it was, this process did not become the cinematic standard, due to the fact that the only sodium vapor prism that was ever invented was owned by Walt Disney, who rented it out at exorbitant prices. A history then not so much of the participatory as the proprietary. However, things are also slightly different today. As our enthused presenter from the BBC shows us, the green screen room is now open. We have been invited to enter the green, to be at once edified and enchanted by the very demonstration of the technology. By this, I mean that even though the workings behind the illusion have been thoroughly exposed, we continue to be entranced, though no longer by the illusion itself, but the making of it. It is the moment of the switch from reality to illusion, from green to screen that becomes the source of fascination, producing the sense of us testing out the technology for ourselves. It captivates us by virtue of the possibilities of creation it lends to the spectator as participant. Indeed, just by going online today, one finds the surest sign of this democratization of the green screen in the expanding public repositories of stock green screen footage. In fact, so extensive is the array that one can find everything from a mythical Chulu, a dancing Mariah Carey, the BBC News banner, to an undulating Singapore flag, all set against an electrifying field of green. Cinema here is a matter of reconstituting space rather than time. It is the layer rather than the cut that is the central element of operation. Accordingly, the amateur filmmaker as compositor does not so much move things along as move things around in a present that endlessly reorganizes itself. For sure, this is not an entirely new phenomenon. We can find this spatialization of cinema already operative in the tacky invention and tourist trap that is the instant green screen booth. In the high-end shopping malls of Marina Bay Sands in Singapore, for instance, stands one such fully automated booth called the Social Pavilion, where the visitor has at his disposal a series of alluring vistas to fill the green behind him and compose a picture that can be uploaded onto social media. Through this fantasy fulfillment machine, one can even gain superhuman powers, as this woman did as she floated through the corridors of the luxury mall. But let's take a closer look at some of these images. Here, we have a man pressing his hand against the facade of a building. He repeats the same pose in several other images, some with the company of much less enthusiastic friends. In another image, another man nearly touches the tip of the rooftop of Marina Bay Sands with his finger. Also a frequent visitor to the booth apparently, he makes a reappearance, this time performing a salute that mirrors the angle of the rooftop. The similarity across these images is that the body of the photograph subject is seen to be adjusting itself to the composition in the background. The subject participates in the image only within the limits defined by a pre-curation, showing how the supposed democratization of the green screen could not have happened without the rise of the template. The template that in facilitating participation also defines the extent to which it can go. And of course, there still remains the limits imposed by the green screen itself, such that the unknowing spectator who is not informed of the hazards of stepping into the green can unfortunately end up decapitated. Returning to the greens of the garden, can we then also tease out the logic of a green space that invites participation in order to control and limit its expressions? After all, are gardens not precisely this paradoxical notion of an enclosed, open space? And what can one further make of the recent push, not just in the direction of the government building more gardens, but of the people being encouraged to become gardeners themselves? As if the garden is no longer just a firmly settled backdrop, but a space into which one enters to modify the green as if it was a giant green screen studio. Here, I turn to the key figure of the community gardener, as it was explicitly championed by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong during the National Day rally of 2014. Throughout much of history and across many parts of the world, this is the figure that is seen to embody the most literal expression of the grassroots movement, the spontaneous and dynamic organization of a community from the ground. In Singapore, however, to the extent that such unscripted and informal acts of community even happen, this happens only within the auspices of a national program, namely the Community in Bloom program that manages the 800 or so community gardens around the island. In fact, in the same speech, PM Lee unveiled a plan for the further centralization of such spontaneously forming communities in the form of a super community garden, or in the Singapore governmental parlance, a community gardening hub. This is to be located in the northwestern region of Singapore and will bring together community gardeners from all over the island, making it the People's Garden. As the Prime Minister appeals at the end of his address, these are your gardens. We want to hear from you. The call made by PM Lee here comes from a long history establishing the link between gardens and communities. While this is a history too lengthy to be discussed here, let's just say that the relationship between the two terms is one marked by a profound ambivalence, having been harnessed both by radical left-wing politics, as well as fascist, colonial, and eugenicist ideologies. In the context of Singapore, the situation presents a rather peculiar formulation, one where the unclaimed pockets of green in the urban landscape are transformed into gardens and branded as free spaces in order to exercise control over the type of plots, botanical or otherwise, that can develop from it. We see this especially in how the garden in the national discourse is privileged as the primary site where the public are called upon to put their imagination to work, to have a say, to express the multiplicity of the people within the delineated green space. The green here is that which screens the imagination in the double sense of the word, providing a screen for it to be projected, at the same time as it submits it to a regime of screening, of checking its varied articulations. Nowhere is this logic more apparent than in the only space in Singapore where public demonstrations can be held without a permit, which is not so incidentally a field of green. This is the Speaker's Corner in Hong Lim Park. First launched in 2000 as a free speech zone, it was not until 2008 that laws were further liberalized to allow public demonstrations to be held within the space. And interestingly, the act of enclosure here does not just allow the actualization of freedom to be closely monitored. It also, just as crucially, achieves the further effect of producing a space of exception. That there was a necessity for such a space was brought home during the events of the 2006 IMF and World Bank meeting held in Singapore, which had the distinction of being only the second time in the meeting's history where outdoor demonstrations were not permitted, with all demonstrations confined to a 14 by 8 meter floor space in the convention center. This, however, did not stop a group of local activists led by members of the political opposition from claiming their right to public protest by holding their demonstration in the then still tightly regulated Speaker's Corner. Occurring on the occasion of an international meeting legitimizing the new global order, the incident shows us how in a world where the suspension of governmentality within the free trade zone has ironically become the normative condition, it is a space of civil liberty that can truly claim exceptionality. And the garden, as that space of seemingly unbridled expression of community, must also be situated within the same ethos. The garden state of Singapore is one where the garden represents not the state, but the state of exception. A few days ago, as I revisited the image of Hsien Loong speaking against a green screen, I tried to engage the green as the participatory space that it is, by inserting in its place, my own set of images. While doing so mostly for the cheap thrill of it, I was also on the lookout for an image that can support the Prime Minister as he speaks before it and gestures towards the future. The effort proved an impossible undertaking. But I suspect that this was due not to any fault of the images themselves, but my constant distraction by the trembling remainder of green that outlines the speaker's body, seeming to suggest that the two images can never fit together. Well, the crude interpretation of this is that perhaps there is no way of combining the future of Singapore and PM Lee within the same image. The more considered reading, however, would say that the unremovable green stain points more broadly to the impossibility of imagining the future within the frame of the present, such that in our rush to fill the green, we must also watch out for the green that cannot be filled, that continue to test the limits of the thinkable. Such is the new cinephilia that attends not to the wind in the trees, but the quiver of the green. Thank you.